This is the Overton Pod. Hello, Kanthan.
Good morning, John. Any chest pains on your part this morning?
No, I don't have any chest pains about people who have been given jobs that I'm jealous of or envious of or just don't agree with because, well, that's just not my personality. I kind of tend to get over the fact that other people have jobs. It's weird.
So
It's
an
not.
interesting question that I think we should be asking people. What does a chief of staff do?
Kanthan, I'm so glad you asked this question because the truth is that a chief of staff is basically an office manager. And the role is quite clearly delineated. I don't know if you have it there in front of you.
I do not.
But there's a manual for ministers, and in that it has the role of a chief of staff, and it's really simple stuff like manage the staff in the office, make sure that the minister is prepared for his upcoming meetings, book accommodation and travel, that kind of stuff. You know, this is secretarial, PA, and a little bit of research. So, I see you're going to China to meet with a whole bunch of people in the agriculture department there. Here's what you should know about China and its agriculture and how it might be able to help us or how we can help them or what deals we're looking at or those types of things. And it's that's basically the role. It's not very complex. In fact, it's so not complex that the ANC has been appointing substandard ministers, ministers as well, but substandard chiefs of staff for pretty much their entire time they've run the government, which is, as we know, more than 30 years. So it's in that context and with that background that last week the mainstream media lost its ever-loving mind about the appointment of Ramon Cabernac to the position of Chief of Staff to John Steenhuisen in the Ministry of Agriculture. And there's a few things here. There's the actual details, which, as I've just alluded to with regards to the actual job. There's then the details about Ramon himself, which is the lies that have been told over the past week and a bit, stating things like lying about his degrees and his qualifications, intentionally calling him a bro or a podcaster, understanding that that's fine. He is a podcaster, and that whole podcast bro thing was picked up by mainly left-wing commentators as some sort of derogatory slur, which of course then people who are podcasters laughed at and made a meme of. But that's how he's been described, which is quite, if you want to just go on face value, is a derogatory way to describe someone who has...
But this is because most of the podcasters that I know of have a significantly larger audience than any of these media outlets.
So this is what I want to get to, which is more interesting than the fact that they've lied about him being a racist and they've lied about him being a bigot. And I do hope he's not the type of guy. I think they're very lucky, because were they to do this with me, there would be several ongoing court cases right now. I would ruin journalists. And I put that out there as a warning. If I ever get the opportunity, if you ever give me the opening or the opportunity, I will take it. And it's not about money because...
But you see, there's no point suing these guys because most of them, if you don't mind the expression, do not have a pot to piss in. And they're going to retire poor.
Yes, no, but Kanthan, the thing I know about, you're absolutely right, which is why I say it's not about money. So I would not sue these people for any kind of monetary return. I would sue them for the things
like kicking a hobo, yes.
The things they hate to do, which is admit they're wrong. I would sue them for that. And frankly, it's not very pleasant being in legal proceedings. And that creates a lot of stress. And these are the types of people who are very anxious because they are never content with life and they've never found contentment in themselves. That's why there's all this projection against someone like Ramon. And so I would take great joy in causing them that anguish because this is what they do on a daily basis to people, and they do it with impunity. Now, I don't think Ramon's going to go down this track. I hope he does, but I don't think he's going to, unfortunately. And So let's talk about the broader issue, which is really about why there's been this freak out and why they are more than a week in the news. Now, it's important for people to note that in general, no major issue stays in the news for more than about 9 days if it's a massive issue.
Even Trump's assassination was gone in 24 hours.
Yeah. So major issues go within about 9 days. Non-major issues, things like social media furores created about chiefs of staff, generally go within 72 hours. So people lose their minds, they publish all their articles, they get their clickbait out of it, and then they move on because there's something else, and people have limited attention spans. This has not been the case here, and I think it's very interesting as to why. Now, what's your take on the why on that? You talking about audiences and audience size.
So if you go back to the history of the DA and, going back to its roots as the Progressive Party, then becoming the Progressive Federal Party, and then becoming the Democratic Party, and then becoming the Democratic Alliance, the DA has always historically been left of center. And, I would say that the politics that the DA historically used to have over the course of the years very closely aligned with a lot of my politics, in that it was commitment to a meritocracy, non-racialism, rule of law, support for a free market, and all of that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But what has happened over the past, shall we say, decade or so, is that there's been a jostling for the heart and soul of the Democratic Alliance, with the desire to swing it increasingly to the left, more along the lines of what has become the abomination that's known as the Democratic Party in the United States.
Absolutely correct.
At the same time, there are within the ranks of the Democratic Alliance those who are very much against the concept of, paying lip service to diversity, inclusion, equity,
DEI, or DIE,
and all of that kind of stuff. Now you have, for the first time, someone who is very publicly opposed to those things, and that really cuts to the chase, because Roman is very definitely a believer in a meritocracy. He's very much a believer in a sense of nationalism, and when I say nationalism, he believes very strongly that South Africa should be for South Africans, and we should be putting ourselves first, which means that we don't believe in open borders and all of the kind of stuff that goes with that.
Yeah, I think if you don't mind, can I interrupt you? Hold it there, but I do want to interrupt to make this point quite clearly, which is, for me, this is about narrative capture. And just to explain what I mean by that is, if you go to a person on the street and you ask them, tell me about the DA, they will instinctively spit out things like racist, white party, white supremacist. Now, people on the street didn't make those things up. They don't just come to them out of thin air. What happens is over time, there's a narrative that gets put out there. Now, most narrative in our societies is created by mainstream media, because that traditionally has been how people got their news and learnt about the world around them. People have busy lives. We all have busy lives. And so you wake up in the morning and you make your kids breakfast, take them to school, go get to your job, work hard, finish up, get home, sort out your kids, your family, dinner, etc., and then maybe by the time you're ready to sort of sit down and relax a little bit for the evening, read a book, watch some television, whatever it is you do, it's maybe 8:30, 9 o'clock, and then you're tired and you're back in bed. So in that concept of how society is structured and functions, The majority of people, unless they have specific interests, it's almost like a hobby. Like, I have interests in politics, so I pay a lot of attention to politics. But I couldn't tell you what's going on in the world of women's netball, for example, because I have no interest there. And so someone who loves women's netball, who could tell you what happens every day there, would not be able to tell you about necessarily what's happening in South African politics, because they don't apply themselves to it. And so what happens is you get these bite-sized chunks fed to you by the mainstream media. Now, when the mainstream media was a trustworthy entity, which used to actually put out truth, then that was relatively reliable, because you could say, okay, what do I know about this political party or this particular issue, or the country I live in, or another country that's in the news? You would go to that bite-sized chunk that you had heard, and you would regurgitate that. And then maybe you would discuss that with people, but that would be your starting point. And so this is the same thing that's happened with the DA. The DA has been maligned as this right-wing, racist, white, etc. All these things it's been maligned at. And every opportunity, and this is why I think this whole Ramon thing is still going on. It's got nothing to do with Ramon in and of himself, although it does have to do with what he represents. But it's because it's an opportunity to once again, and remember, think about all the reporting you've seen about the DA around the election, before the election, in between elections, for the last 10 years, when Helen Zille was in charge and mayor of Cape Town. Think about all the reporting since then, and every single so-called scandal, every bit of like proper, like juicy bit of reporting on the DA. What has it always said? It's always said the same thing. It's always stuck to this: the DA, white, racist, bigoted, etc., right wing. And that's a narrative that's been created which is completely false. And how do we know it's false? It's because of what you've just said. It's because if I look at the DA and the Democrat Party in the United States, and it's very easy to do this right now because we've just had an election in South Africa, and we're about to have an election in the United States. And Helen Zille herself has made it clear she would vote for Kamala Harris, and before that, Joe Biden. Okay? Most members of the DA who are high-profile members will happily say that they will support the Democrats over the Republicans. If you go break it down issue by issue, the Democrats, very, very hard pro-abortion. The DA, same story. LGBTQ, well, you don't know. The Republicans are actually supportive of LGBTQ rights. So are the Dems. But then the Dems are the ones painting rainbows on the road. And so are the DA. If you go and look at immigration issues, the DA sides more with open borders than they do with closed borders. If you go look at in foreign affairs, the DA thinks the Ukrainians should continue fighting the evil Russians at the expense of all of their men and their entire country. So the DA and the Democrats line up very well. And in fact, if anyone separates this for a moment and says, what are the Democrats? The Democrats are a very much left-wing party, and on many issues, they're actually far left. On economic issues, they're certainly far left at this point. They want price controls, for example. They want taxes on unrealized gains. We must maybe discuss that a little bit later. So the Democrat Party, no one would argue, is a right-wing party. The DA lines up almost perfectly.
Well, in terms of pronouncements that come from...
That's correct.
From particular members on particular issues. But at the same time, John,
yes,
let's be very clear that I tend to judge people in terms of very specific actions that take place. And I will say that there's a very distinct difference between, let's say, Alan Winde in the Western Cape, and you look at the track record of Dean McPherson in KZN. You look in terms of what Papas has been doing out in KZN as well. There's been a practicality in terms of how problems have actually been solved.
This is why people love the DA.
Yes, and this is why we love the DA, because of the fact that things actually work.
Because when they're not talking about policies which don't matter,
yes,
and are not going to change.
The reason why the policies actually do matter, and this is where Roman actually comes into it, is because Roman is very clearly of the opinion that our policies at an international level should be shaped in the best interests of South Africa.
Yes.
And what that fundamentally means is that we end up getting the best possible deal for the people of our country. And you take this very simple situation right now of being across in China, which is where he happens to be. And, let's be very clear. He's very much at the heart and soul of all of the discussions that are taking place with the Chinese. And my experience with the Chinese, I've been to Beijing quite a few times. I've been to Hong Kong dozens of times. And they play hardcore in terms of business, but they also work in their national interest. And the point is that when they're sitting across the table from someone who is having a discussion with them on exactly the same basis, they get that. And they're able to negotiate on the basis that, look, this is a person who understands what he's talking about, and he understands where we are coming from, and we get where he's coming from. So let's actually carve out a deal that's going to be equitable, that's going to be able to work in enlightened self-interest for all of us.
Yeah.
Which is very different to saying that we need to have globalization, we need to have open borders, we need to have free trade, without considering the cost of how that impacts upon the destruction of jobs back in South Africa, the destruction of industries back in South Africa, which has been the case pretty much over the past 30 years. We've had a net outflow of productivity at an industrial level. And if we do not actually reverse that trend, we are going to end up in a scenario where we are going to be purchasing all of the stuff that is manufactured in China, and we're not going to be able to afford the food that we are producing because it's all going to be shipped out of the country.
All right. So I agree with you, and I think what you're getting at there is that what you're seeing as the concern with that this is created, the reason why there's such a freak out, the reason why more than a week later this person is still headline news in our left-wing media, which is all of our media basically, is really because he has a seat at the table. And I mean, is that correct? Is that a fair assessment that he's got a seat at the table with these practical kind of nationalists? Another word that has been completely bastardized, because in the term of meaning, I care about my country, I want what's best for my country, so that my country can be the best it can be for its citizens. That's nationalism.
Absolutely. And so to this point, and I'll use two very specific examples because you want to talk about diversity. And let's use we'll use three very specific examples, which are China, India, and Russia. And if you want to talk diversity, those are probably the most diverse societies on the face of the earth, in terms of linguistic groups, in terms of religion that actually is able to thrive within their borders. But nationalism basically means that at no point does any of that sense of whatever you identify with get subverted to the national interest. So if you're China, the interests of China come first. It does not matter whether you're a Uyghur. It does not matter whether you speak Mandarin. It does not matter whether you are Christian. It does not matter whether you are Taoist. It doesn't matter whether you are Buddhist. You are Chinese first. Ditto in the case of Russia. You know that you have very strong Jewish enclaves within Russia. You have very strong Muslim enclaves within Russia. But at no point is it possible to actually subvert the national interest of being Russian. And you get back to India, and it's exactly the same thing. You have all of these states with their own languages. And when I talk about languages, I mean languages that have very distinct script. It's not the situation that we have in South Africa, where the Nguni languages are basically offshoots of the same mother tongue. You have literally within hundreds of kilometers away from each other, you've got Tamil, you've got Telugu, you've got Kannada, you've got Malayalam. These are all distinct languages with their own script, their own history of literature, and yet they all come together.
As a matter of interest, what is are there 12 official languages, 20 official languages, 40 official languages of India, or what is the official language of state?
So the official languages of state are English and Hindi.
That makes complete sense.
Yes.
Yeah. Two, the most common ones, I
Exactly.
assume. Well, the international one
Yes.
and the international one, and then the most common one spoken
Yes.
for government purposes, because it actually costs money to increase the number of languages you make official. And that's it. And
Quite
everyone
right.
else just gets on with it, right?
Yes, everyone else gets on with it, but the point is that Tamil Nadu has Tamil as its official language. Karnataka has Kannada as its official language. Kerala has Malayalam.
So within states.
Yeah, so within
essentially.
states, yeah.
So we could say in the Eastern Cape that Xhosa would be the official language in that province, along
Yes.
with, for example, English maybe. But then outside of that province, that would not in fact
Correct,
be the
yes,
case.
Yeah, because it makes no sense,
I
from
do.
my
I do.
point of
Look,
view.
I'm a little bit less bullish on China, for example. I'm not. I have my problems with China. I hear your points that you're making.
No, you and I have very distinct problems with China.
Yeah.
We don't like the surveillance state. We don't like the authoritarianism. We don't like
and the tyrant aspect in terms of like what you talked about, the Uyghurs, for example. There's no doubt that there's abuse of the Uyghurs going on.
The Uyghurs, that's a narrative that I used to believe in very strongly until I finally went down that rabbit hole and I discovered that was manufactured outrage. And again, I'm going to draw a parallel.
I'm not down that rabbit hole, so you might have to go there.
I'm going to draw a parallel with something else that I use as an example, which is the whole narrative about a genocide. Okay? And let's be very clear that the single definition of a genocide that I think makes sense is that over a period of time, you have a net decrease in populace.
I think that's fair.
Okay. Now, the Uyghurs, have been among having the largest TFR in China for the very specific reason that China had a one-child policy for a number of years, but the Uyghurs were exempt from it.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so that, again, cuts to the chase. When you talk about a Uyghur genocide, I don't want us to get drawn into the rabbit hole of the other.
I think we can agree, though, putting people into camps, for example,
And
those photos are real. They're not manufactured.
No, those photos are manufactured.
Oh, really?
Yes, those photos are manufactured.
Completely manufactured.
And I will take you down through the history of those photographs because I used to believe very strongly on those until I went down that rabbit hole and investigated it and discovered that the photos that were put out on the perspective of them being training camps where people were being press ganged into. No, not true. But let's not get distracted.
Yes.
Let's steer back to the question of.
What I wanted to say before I said I'm not that bullish on China and I have my problems with it. Let's not go down that hole. But what I was getting at is that this used to be applicable to many other places which we would consider more in line with our values, or previously certainly. So the United States, it used to be that you were American before Republican or Democrat.
Exactly.
Right. In fact, being Republican or Democrat wasn't that big a thing. It was a thing around election time because you need to be registered for either party, like a card-carrying member. You can't go to the ANC's conference if you're not a card-carrying member of the ANC, if you're not part of the branch structures. Same goes for the Democrats and the Republicans. Works the same way. But it never used to matter that much. Americans understood that they wanted America to be the best for all of the people in that country, whether they were Democrats, Republicans, Independents. It didn't matter. It only mattered that America was strong for its people. And if it was, then everyone benefited. It didn't matter what their political affiliations were. The same applied in Europe for centuries, in fact. Our entire history is shaped by the fact that people wanted the best for their nations. Now, you can criticize what they did to achieve the best for their nations. Napoleon thought the best thing to do for his nation would be to go on a quest of conquerage and to essentially imbue French culture into as much of the world as possible. So did the British. And in fact, before them, the Romans, the Greeks, and I'm leaving out the Turks, not the Turks, but you know what I'm referring to. The Ottomans, yes. This has been the story of mankind, really. And it's worked. And have there been problems along the way? Sure. Was there an issue with the Vikings who thought the same thing? The Vikings were proud Vikings. They believed in themselves. They believed in their culture. Was it great that they sailed to different lands and raped and pillaged? No, not by modern standards, certainly. But the idea that you want the best for your people and that you will do what it takes to do that is the story of man. And this notion that the West is currently going through, where we will do absolutely everything we can to appease everyone on the outside of what we believe in, of what we stand for or stood for, and hope to remain a cohesive structure is...
It's impossible. It falls apart.
Absolutely. And so maybe to just close this broader topic we've been talking about, which was what we started with. And as I said, in minutiae, it's about Ramon Kabanak. But in greater perspective, the 35,000-foot view is that it's really about where our country stands. And you need to get out of your head that the DA is even on the right. They're on their best day, which is a day I like, on their best day, when they do things I agree with, they are very centrist. Very. They are literally, 2,000 Democrats.
Look, frankly, I'm very happy to have them being extremely centrist.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that. But what I want to point out is the freak out is because one person who is not a centrist, okay, and again, right wing has been maligned. There's nothing wrong with right wing. Go to America and look at the amazing thinkers that have come out of the right.
But let's just touch upon this thing about right wing.
Go for it.
Very briefly. Okay, so 5 years ago, Roman and I and Neo Kwaho sat down over coffee and we said that we were going to set up a political party. And the reason why we wanted to do that is because we didn't have anyone to vote for. And the very specific reason at the time was that the DA had swung so completely to the left and was so completely losing it that it was very clear that something had to be done to reset around values. And we sat down and we agreed on what we basically said were 10 principles that we thought should be driving us as a country. And first and foremost in that was liberty. Okay. Then you had equality. I think we can all agree what those things are. Tolerance and absolute protection of freedom of expression. Okay. In other words, there's no such thing as hate speech. Private property rights protected by law. Rule of law. The right to work, which is very different from the right to a job. And we'll touch on that again shortly when we talk about minimum wages. The right to be secure on your own property and to defend yourself against intruders. In other words, the castle doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And the right to bear arms.
Yes. Yeah. So and we're coming to that as well. Free markets and international free trade based on enlightened self-interest. And we use the very specific examples. If the best place to buy agricultural tech is going to be Israel, that's what we do. If the best place to buy oil is Iran, that's what we do, because we put South Africa first in terms of those interests. Firearms for self-defense. And the last was spontaneous order and civil society. 10 things. Now tell me, out of those 10 things that Roman still believes in, I know, what you would consider to be right wing.
Yeah.
Because these are all centrist positions that, led to the founding of the United States of America, which, I've said to many people at the time, which at its peak was the greatest country the world has ever seen. Now, of course, it's gone.
And many of those things, you talk about the United States, but many of those things are present or have been present, most of them in other places that people love to talk about. Canada, Sweden, Denmark, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany. Those things, many of them, not all of them, because there's going to be some disagreement. The guns, for example, is always a point of disagreement. But many of those things have been foundational pillars. In the case of France, literally foundational pillars. They build pillars of their buildings and label them liberté, égalité, fraternité. So, excuse my bastardization of the French. It's just fascinating. And this is the point I made about the bite-sized chunks. people get fed the idea of this is right wing. Right wing equals bad. This is not a good idea because we say so. Not for any logic or any reason. Nobody's reasoning through this. And the freak out is partially because someone with these ideas, which have been laminated as right wing, but are in fact the foundational pillars of all successful societies up until this point, certainly post Enlightenment, but even before that, that's part of that freak out. But part of the freak out is the narrative shift. Is that there's a chance that there might be a change of view, that there might be something else people start to see. A lot of the freak
they don't
out.
want the possibility that things will actually work better.
Yes, or change for the better. Because I do want to get into NHR because that's reared its head again. But it's this constant idea of we must go against basic logic and reason, things that have worked for a very long time, and we must keep chasing this terrible. You said there, you spoke about equality is part of the doctrine. Am I correct? Which is very different to equity.
Absolutely.
And that is a word trick that's been used over the last few decades, where people now think equity, which is equal outcomes. So in other words, we all want to get to the same point, which is a nice way of describing communism, which is not possible to get to and results in shooting people and murdering millions. So it's this kind of discussion that we're having, which is, I think we both agree, is the point of this podcast. And we'll undoubtedly be called podcast bros for the rest of our life, Kanthan. Your achievements up to this point are nothing, because when they find something on you, and they will, and when they find something on me, and they will, and you better have it airtight, journalists, you better have it airtight, otherwise I'm coming for you. When they find something, we will be nothing more than podcast bros, because that's the narrative, you see. It cannot be that a thoughtful, well-thinking, well-read guy has been appointed to a job. We don't agree with the way he views the world, but that's the way he views the world, and we wish him all the best of luck.
They do not know how he views the world, because everything they say in terms of how he views the world is a construct.
Yes.
They've made it up. They take sound bites out of context, and they use it to paint a picture. And then they toss in as many adjectives as they possibly can.
Yeah, and the usuals, as I've said ad infinitum on this podcast, right wing, racist, bigot. So they just need to use these keywords, knowing that most people don't read past a headline, or if they do, they read a very short article. And as long as the keywords, that's what they'll remember, and then they move on. And now that narrative is formulated in their minds, and so that's it. That's what they know about this particular person or this particular topic. And I guess it's once again something we've spoken about so commonly, which is the complete collapse of media and journalism and the untrustworthy nature of the entire industry and all of the people who work in it.
But at the same time, there hasn't been anything that has really stepped in to fill the gap at the level of providing up-to-date information on very specific things. And there were things like the demise of SAPA, the South African Press Association. And the useful thing about SAPA is that you would get reports on an ongoing basis from every part of the country. So SAPA would have a correspondent in Moimesi, Sonobroekiesfontein. And if there was something happening in that town on any particular day, the SAPA correspondent would report on it. So if there was a court case, if there was a fire, if there was a school play, there would be someone who would be reporting on it, and it would filter through into the national media, find its way through into your local papers, and we would be kept up to date on what's happening all around the world. We don't have boots on the ground anymore. We have people behind laptops who have opinions on things. They do not go out and actually perform real research. They read through papers. They take things out of context. And none of the stuff that they put out has a who, what, where, when, why, and how, which is a classic case in terms of what Stephen Krutas has done this morning, where you have the top story in the Daily Maverick.
Top story.
The top story.
In the country of South Africa.
Yeah, and it's an opinion piece on how an appointment of an office manager for a minister is going to tear apart the national government. I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, Lesotho, the premier of the province, the most powerful province in the country, with the most economic pull and sway, he goes against the GNU. That's not going to pull apart the GNU. That's not gonna do it at all. But no, as you say, the appointment of an office manager, that's going to do it. It's just the dishonesty and these guys cannot understand why they are failing. They cannot understand why they can't make ends meet. They cannot understand why they can't expand their subscriber base. They just don't get it. They are bewildered by it. If you took foreign NGO funding and sort of wealthy billionaire funding with billionaires who like to influence things and politically, if you took that funding away from our mainstream media, all of them would collapse overnight. They cannot afford to feed themselves. And none of these people can understand what happened between the 70s, where they could afford to feed themselves without any of that funding, and now they all put it down to, it's gone digital. It's got nothing to do with digital. You used to have printing presses, guys. You used to have the Star newspaper. I went there when I was a lot younger, when I was a kid. My dad took me there. It was fascinating. I mean, the Star used to have these giant. They had a massive building in town, Risick Street, I think it was. Was it Risick?
47 Sour Street.
Sour. That's right.
I went to work there in 1996. At the time, Dion Duplessis was managing director, and I went on board as his deputy.
A magnificent building.
He took me through the entire building on my first day at work.
Yes.
More than 1,000 employees, including the print section.
Yes, but you walked into the front, and you could have been in the Ritz-Carlton.
But he walked me through the entire premises and introduced me by name to every single person that we encountered along the way.
Yeah.
And it was a money-making machine.
We went down into that basement, and there was just a floor. Imagine a parking garage.
Yep.
But it was, as far as the eye could see, printing presses running 24/7 pretty much.
Yes.
It was incredible.
And you were printing 40,000 copies per hour.
There you go. And just paper and ink and these giant, loud mechanical machines, and 1,000 people employed in a building that was in the middle of the CBD, which was expensive to run and own and operate. But people who ran newspapers became rich. And journalists were relatively well paid. They were never wealthy, but they were in the middle classes. It wasn't a problem.
Well, I managed the Cape Times for 2 years. From 97 to 99. And at the time, it had actually been running at a loss for a couple of years. It made a profit for the first time in 15 years. And we pushed its circulation to the highest levels ever. On some days we were selling more than 60,000 copies of the Cape Times. Now, of course, it sells a couple of thousand per day, if that.
Sure. And again, they'll say, but digital. But the problem is not digital. The problem is you guys have become liars, and you've become narrative projectors and creators and protectors, and you don't tell the truth. And people are not that dumb anymore. And so we see this now with X, for example, because on X, people have true free speech because Elon Musk believes, as you do, in unlimited freedom of expression, unless it violates some sort of law somewhere. He says he will comply with laws. However, he basically people have free speech. So what happens is media lies, as they did about Donald Trump going to Arlington National Cemetery for the third reunion of 13 Marines being killed in Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's, because she says she was the last person in the room when the decision was made. despicable and terribly managed withdrawal from Afghanistan. 13 service members died. They won't attend any kind of memorials for these people. Donald Trump goes with the invitation from the families of these soldiers, and the media reports it as Donald Trump taking his opportunity to illegally politicize the campaign using Arlington Cemetery. And that's not at all what happened. But then on X, it's very clear to see what happened because the information is there.
Every single one of the families comes out and says,
that's right.
We invited him, we wanted him there, and we are grateful. And we want him back there because he would have ensured this would never have happened.
Right. And so you now have people going, okay, but the media is lying again. And so they keep getting caught in these lies. And, you know, if 20,000 people hit that article on Daily Maverick, if their traffic a day is a couple of 100,000 people, what do they think the traffic on the morning shot was? Because it wasn't much lower than that. And the reality is that those people have been listening to Ramon. Some of them disagree with him on lots of things. I disagree with Ramon on things. You, I'm sure, disagree with him on some things. The point is that we're thinking humans, so we can go, I disagree with him on that, I agree with him on this. Doesn't make him a bad person, doesn't make him a pariah, doesn't make him a racist or a bigot. And so then you come out with all this false reporting, and you're not hurting him. You're hurting you. The entire mainstream media is taking this giant knock to go after this guy who, for most of the country, was a nobody, just like most of the newspapers are nobodies, okay, because there's 60 million people in the country. And in fact, the most read and listened to things are none of the media outlets you and I even talk about. But those media outlets are the ones that seem to have a lot of influential power, certainly in circles. So in terms of people who have money, in terms of people who have access to the politicians and the politicians themselves. And it just, you are losing trust. And when your newspapers, digital or otherwise, shut down, you should not be surprised, because this week shows you why. This is the reason why you are lying.
But the question that I still need to wrap my head around, and I'm having great difficulty understanding exactly where this comes from, is at the same time that you have this, lemming-like quest for self-destruction, these outlets still continue to use every single opportunity to undermine the DA. And I'm not able to wrap my head around how this works. Because, look, I think you and I have both outlined the problems that we have with the DA, in terms of these very specifically leftist policies. That does not stop us from actually recognizing that having the DA in control at an administrative level
is a good
thing. And, we're constantly making this point.
At minimum, a better thing than having the ANC in control at an administrative level.
And we do make this point on an ongoing basis.
You don't get to pick perfect.
Yes.
This is the NHL. Let's bring it up now.
Yes.
Aaron Motsoaledi has come out in the last 10 days, guns blazing. This should be the top story. But it shouldn't be the top story in the way it's being sold. So the media are running Aaron Motsoaledi's propaganda and carrying water for him. They're coming out and saying that Aaron Motsoaledi is saying that medical aids are going, say goodbye. No one's criticizing that statement. No one in the media is saying, even in commentary, is saying in mainstream media, saying we should fight against this. By the way, as a side note, you should absolutely fight against this. But they not only that, now I see they're carrying water for him by carrying his comments at saying the warnings against NHI is the same as the Swat Kafar warnings during apartheid. There's no comparison there. None whatsoever. The warnings about NHI are absolutely true. If NHI happens, you are going to suffer, and so is your family. Simple as that. And, it's this idea, now you talk about it, you can believe in a utopia, you can believe in a place where there's just rainbows and unicorns and free healthcare. You can believe in that, but you'd be an idiot and you'd be wrong. Or you can believe in a rational, market-driven solution to providing people the best possible healthcare you can buy at the lowest possible price it can be sold for.
Exactly, and so this is a point that I've made in my book, and I've written an extensive chapter on it. Firstly, outlining exactly why NHI is a disaster, but then secondly, outlining why we actually do need a health safety net, and how to actually provide it in a way that doesn't add to the budget over and above what we're currently spending, and in fact will drastically improve it, and possibly at the end of the day end up spending less money on the part of the entire country. And frankly, one of the models that I used on this is the Israeli healthcare system, which actually allows people to have a choice of subsidized private healthcare facilities, which all have minimum basic payments, and everyone else is at liberty to top up over and above that in exactly the same way as we do currently with medical aids.
So I partially agree with this. We disagree, I think, on details. But the point I'm making is exactly what you're talking about. Would you prefer the ANC or the DA as the administrative state? Now, that's not to say the DA is perfect. It's the same as, would you prefer NHI, which is going to collapse everything, including not just healthcare, but once healthcare starts collapsing, the economy's gone. Doctors are going to flee in giant numbers or not work. Simple as that. And so what's going to happen is that's also a large part of your tax base. So not just the doctors, all the people they employ around them. So, and the entire medical industry that is propped up because of the private healthcare industry. And the things that the public healthcare industry has access to because the private healthcare industry pays for those things to exist in the first place. We're talking about things like orthopedic implants, which will not exist in this country in the way they do currently if NHR happens. So the whole country is at risk of significant collapse as a result of this policy. So you can have that, which is the ANC running the administrative state, or you can have a move towards trying to provide everyone with the best possible healthcare you can, which will absolutely not give everyone the best access all the time, but is the example of the DA running the administrative state. So it's not the best possible option. It's not what you would describe.
No, but it's better.
But it's better, exactly. And you can continually improve it. You can always make it that much better. You can, economic growth is the answer to true quality healthcare for everyone. The reason why people refer to Nordic countries and go, oh, but they have national health systems that work. No, what's occurred there is, yes, in the case of those systems, the public have said the government can pay for all of it and the government can fund all of it. But that is all being funded because those countries have a giant amount of money. In the case of places like Denmark, they have literal sovereign wealth funds which fund their healthcare, which then is able to fund the healthcare. The NHI is not the answer for this country. The answer is that we have amongst the best, it's rated, this is not me saying this, we have amongst the best healthcare in private in the world. So if you just take that level of healthcare and you compare it to everywhere else in the world, it ranks in the top 10 of healthcare that you can find in the whole world, right? The answer is to find out how we can get as many people and ultimately all the people access to that system.
Well, you see, the most crucial thing that if you think of every single person in the black middle class who is now on medical aid, do you think that they'll be willing to give that up?
I don't think they want to. I know that the ANC lost 5% of the vote towards the election as a result of that.
I can't imagine a situation, where you have, a young black couple living in four ways, kids at school, suddenly wanting to stand in line at one of these public hospitals. And can you imagine them even continuing to vote for that scenario? No, it's not going to happen.
Well, I would take it one step further. I think that most people in this country, and I know this having spent a lot of time as a journalist around hospitals, obviously, because journalists just hang around hospitals. But I know for a fact that people who go to public hospitals aspire to medical aid. They don't want government health care.
No.
They don't want what's offered there. They want private health care. They aspire to it. In fact, they very often make a plan to make it happen. That the number that, only 20% or 10% or whoever's quoting different figures, but low numbers have access to private healthcare, again, is a lie. This is a narrative. This is not true. The reality is that more than 80% of this country accesses private healthcare. We've discussed this on the podcast before. The majority of your needs are throughout your life and can be dealt with by a general practitioner. All general practitioners are by definition in private practice. There's a handful that work in state facilities and clinics, for example, but most clinics are mainly staffed with nurses, not doctors. The majority of people go to general practitioners, and their health needs are dealt with by general practitioners. So that's just to start. You now talk about more advanced healthcare. That's not going to happen in the state just because the state decides to steal the private sector. And then, on top of it, pay the companies that run those hospitals less, pay the doctors who work in those hospitals less, treat the nursing staff in those hospitals the same way they do in public, which is why the efficiency rates in public versus private are so vastly different. Right? If you talk...
but let's also not underplay the destruction that gets caused by the public healthcare unions to which most of the nurses belong, which, pretty much makes them unfireable and has led to the complete breakdown in terms of these hospital structures. But then, if you were a doctor, you would have worked in these public healthcare facilities.
Yeah, if only.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say, I know a lot about the public health facilities, way more than any journalist currently writing on the NHI. And I have an open offer to anyone who has a significant platform. I'm not debating trolls, guys. I'm not interested. But if you come from the likes of the mainstream media or the DA, I offered this to the DA who's very bad on the NHI. They know they don't think it's a great idea, but they're flip-flopping on how to deal with that exactly. They're trying to make friends with the ANC. They don't want to upset the GNU, etc.
But you see, where this comes down to is that the DA is firmly wedded to this idea of a capable state. And it's what drives their entire narrative. And, the idea that the state should be trying its best to control everything, which is why you had this absurd situation in the Western Cape where you suddenly needed to get approval from the authorities before you were able to connect your solar panels to your house because of a belief that it was going to mess with the grid and therefore you needed to get it licensed. But licensing ultimately ends up being a way of controlling the way in which these things happen, as opposed to saying, here are the standards and here's what we require in terms of electricians being certified to be able to put in place all of these solar installations, and it would have flowed. You look at the uptake in terms of
which is what they eventually had to do, by the way.
Yes, I know. But if you look in terms
but it took them 2 years to get to that point.
But if you look in terms of Gauteng and the massive spread in terms of solar in this province, which, again, is because of the fact that when you turn the markets loose and you allow them to do what they do best, then things actually flourish. But I think this is a good point at which we should tap into that question.
I just want to finish my debate challenge. So anyone from the mainstream media and what the DA used to call it, Shadow Minister of Health, the woman, her name eludes me right now, but she's been wrong on everything from COVID onwards. She's called for some discussions about monkeypox 2 weeks ago or something, foolishly. Her as well. I would love to have her on and debate it. Now, she won't, I don't think, because I will wipe the floor with these people. because they don't know what they're talking about, and everything is driven by their feelings or their belief in the socialist utopia. And it needs to end because they're going to cause mass suffering.
No, but John, I mean, socialism will work. It just hasn't had a chance to be done.
That's the problem, Kanthan. So let's go into what you wanted to get onto.
So you might remember that when we were talking about the unemployment figures, which
are terrible.
Which
Although
horrendous.
you and I don't fully believe them, I think we need to point that out.
Well, they now say it's 33.5%. In fact, we know that it's significantly higher than that because, that's a measurement of active job seekers. But and it was, I think, Pumlani Majosi who made the point that we have the highest unemployment rate in the world. What's going on? And he asked whether this is the apartheid legacy. And I said, jobs will grow in proportion to economic growth. It really is that simple.
Yeah.
And when population growth outpaces economic growth, which is the situation we have right now, the economy cannot create jobs to keep up. And people don't get this. Okay, because if the economy is actually expanding at a faster rate, it doesn't matter how many more new South Africans we are making. Just so long as the amount of productivity of the country, which means the amount of money that we are generating, which is not the same as printing money, let's be very clear, the amount of wealth that we are actually generating outpaces the growth in population. That's the path to prosperity. So I said there are 4 things that we do that will make this work. So the first thing we do is repeal broad-based black economic empowerment. So
Okay, but why, Kanthan? You're racist for saying that.
So
you
why?
obviously hate black people.
So the
You
problem,
want white people only to run companies, Kanthan.
the problem that we are trying to address in terms of broad-based black economic empowerment, and remember, the very idea of broad-based black economic empowerment was to take people who are indigent, who don't have the ability to actually extricate themselves from poverty, and to give them a starting point so that they could actually be incentivized to pull themselves out of poverty, which means that you then end up with, let's say, a preferential procurement system that says that if you have the opportunity to build these businesses into the network that you're procuring from, then you do so. And you do so on the basis that everything else is equal, that, the price performance ratio has to be in place. But the critical thing that people forget, the reason why we wanted to do this was to extricate people from poverty. And I think all of us agree that we want to extricate people from poverty. So why do you need to have a race-based measure? Because poverty is measurable. You're able to see immediately this business is this small, it hires this many people, and the income levels of their employees are at this particular level. It doesn't really matter whether they are black or whether they are white. You want to extricate people from poverty. Poverty does not discriminate. So just simply make poverty the marker. And what that does is then removes the absurd situation that we have right now, where people get to acquire the contract simply because they're black, but the people who do are the cadres, the deployees. They're the ones who end up with the contracts. And so you keep growing this wealthy politicized class at the complete expense of the masses of the country. And let's be very clear, if you award these contracts on the basis of poverty as the marker, because the overwhelming majority of poor people in this country happen to be black, the overwhelming majority of those contracts will go to black people. But you avoid a situation where you are racially fragmenting the country and causing this ongoing sense of chaos, which, we see very clearly the DEI initiatives exist solely to push that agenda.
Yeah.
They want to drive people apart by creating racial tension.
Yeah, I mean that's the story of our entire political narrative, essentially.
Yes.
Every election, that's all we hear about, racism, right?
Yes.
But most people do not actually have, it's not an issue. What I mean by that is that, because this will be misinterpreted, it's not that racism isn't an issue. It is. It obviously, when it happens, it's a problem. It's not that it doesn't happen. It's just that in most interactions on a daily basis that the majority of people in this country have, those interactions are completely fine, normal, and bereft of racism.
Absolutely. And I keep telling people, if you want a single example of how well South Africans get together, go to any large shopping mall on a payday weekend and look at the people who are standing in line for the ATMs.
Yeah.
And you watch the conversations that take place, the interactions between them, and that is your melting pot of South Africa. You're able to see them right there.
Yeah,
and they get along splendidly.
I'll give you a better one. I'll give you a better one that everybody loves. Even the media loves this one. The media loves this. The Springbok rugby game. Springbok victory. Stadium is filled with people from all different backgrounds.
You must admit that's a more recent example. Okay,
it is more recent. Look, the reality is that, again, people have very little time. You will find racism, for example, online, and the reason I think that occurs is because, number one, it's often anonymous,
let's be very
distant.
clear. You will find bigotry online.
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, racism, bigotry. The point is it's because it's at a distance. It's often anonymous, even if it's not. It's still at that distance. So you can't FAFO, and the other thing is it's people with way too much time on their hands. People who obsess over these things. What are you doing with your life if you have the time to worry about someone's skin color, right? If I wanted to be racist, I wouldn't have the time to be because I'm busy. I'm busy doing my life, right? I'm busy right now. We're recording a podcast. I don't have time to hate you as an Indian guy because we're busy. I'm being productive, right? And it's just, what would be the point of that? How would that fit into any value chain here? It doesn't. And so most South Africans aren't racist in their day-to-day dealings because literally it's just not a part of the value chain. It doesn't provide any additional value to existence, to life. In fact, it really deducts value because it's firstly a waste of time, and secondly, you break the single greatest asset that you have in terms of your ability to connect with society, which is networking. Everything we do and we have is as a result of relationships that we create. You really can't be an island. You can if you want to, but ultimately you're going to have problems generating any kind of, not even wealth, just money. You can't do that without relationships. This is a requirement. So, the racism stuff, and as you've mentioned, is really a narrative that's been driven across the South African society. It's constantly focused on by media. It's constantly spoken about. I mean, I think I haven't listened to them for decades now, but every time someone tells me about 702 talk radio, all they tell me is that that's all they discuss all the time is race. It's just it's a 24-hour race station. And why? To achieve what? It's just utterly pointless. So that's a bit of a tangent, but I suppose it speaks a lot to your labor point.
Yes. So again, in the context of the labor point, so I started off by saying we repeal the broad-based black economic.
Sure.
We repealed triple BEE. Then we look at the Labor Relations Act. Now, the problem with the Labor Relations Act is that it imposed this idea of collective bargaining across entire industries. And the net result of that, and I'll use the very specific example of the textile industry, is that when you have the ability for a collective bargaining process to implement minimum wage standards across the entire industry, it means that you are effectively killing jobs that would otherwise be able to sustain a local community.
Okay, so I want to be the devil's advocate.
Yes.
Because I think I agree with that. But I think what people often say in response is, okay, so you're saying unions essentially are kneecapped. They might exist, but they'd be kneecapped because they wouldn't be able to negotiate. They could negotiate for their members, perhaps, but that wouldn't affect other things. And in fact, if they did that, they'd negotiate against themselves. So in other words, a labor union comes along and says, we represent all the till people at Pick and Pay, Checkers, and so we want you to pay them a minimum of 5,000 Rand a month. And otherwise we're walking out, we're striking, and eventually Checkers or Pick and Pay, whoever, agrees to it and pays them the 5,000 Rand a month. But if you don't have the Labour Relations Act, then what ends up happening is there's a whole bunch of people who are not union members who turn around and go, why don't you just employ me for 4,000? Right?
Exactly.
All right. Now, so that's the argument. Well, now if you take that away, what will then happen is they'll just start employing people for 4,000. Because why would you employ people for 5 if you could employ them for 4? Yeah, right. And so I think being devil's advocates, the argument from people often comes, and I'm not saying they are the devil. I'm saying the argument comes, and it is one of this. It's if we don't have that kind of regulation on business, then big business especially, will abuse people, and it will basically run roughshod over their so-called rights, okay? Because the Labour Relations Act, I think a lot of people view as something that protects the rights of workers.
So let's use the very specific example of striking workers in a supermarket chain. Mm-hmm. Okay, now the pattern, and you can look at this across entire industries. The pattern is that you will have the trade unions who will come forward and say, right, it's time for our wage talks, and we want a 15% increase over the next year. And then you have management who comes in and they say, well, we're going to give you a 2% increase over the next year. And then they'll go back and forth, and eventually they'll not be able to reach an agreement. And the union eventually says, we are going to strike. So strike action commences, people are out on the streets, the business is not running a profit for the period of the strike. More crucially, the workers are not getting paid for the period of the strike. You go through a 2-month period, say, where the workers are out on the streets, they have their picket lines, and they are protesting against the fact that they haven't gotten their pay increases yet. And eventually, you'll get back to the negotiating table, and you will have the employer eventually settling at a price point that was, let's say, 1 percentage point higher than what they had originally offered. And then everyone goes back to work. Now, here's what is absolutely evil about what has just happened. Okay? It's because the workers have not been paid for 2 months.
Yes. And we'll never get that money back.
And they will never get that money
even
back.
After the increase.
Even after their increase. And the unions are able to say, hey, guess what, guys? We've secured a victory. Okay? Because they only offered 4%, and now we've gotten you 5%. Whereas, if they had just shut up in the first place and done the numbers, they would have actually recognized that this is the best possible thing that we can do right now. But we must also get back to the point about whether a wage that is being paid is exploitative. My case on this is very simple. A wage is exploitative at the point at which you don't have people who are willing to work for that price. And how do you get...
explain that. Yeah. Okay. I think you need to expand on that.
Okay. So, and that ties in directly with the question of why minimum wages are basically wrong.
Yes.
Okay. Because the idea behind a minimum wage is it says that there is a basic value at which people should be willing to work for, at which they must get paid. It doesn't take into account the fact that in the absence of being able to be hired at that price point, would a person be willing to work for less simply to put food on the table? And the answer to that is yes. Okay, so we have a country right now that has massive unemployment and which has massive poverty as a direct result of that. And we say right now that the masses of this country end up with a grant of 300 Rand a month. So you're willing to say that we expect people to survive on 300 Rand a month, but you think that paying someone 500 Rand a month is exploitative. That doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. Because rest assured, there are people who are more than willing to be able.
But Kanthan, shame. The government can only afford $350 a month, Kanthan. The private sector can afford so much more.
No, they can't.
Yeah.
No, they can't. And the reason why businesses are shutting down in the private sector is precisely because of the fact that they can't afford it.
I want to give I agree with everything you've said, but I hope when people watch this, if they have a different opinion, that maybe they're convinced by the arguments or the discussions that we have. And I think anyone who's engaged in employment before, either as an employee, but very importantly as an employer, would know that if you put a job out into the market and you are not willing to pay market-related prices, if you try to undercut people, they actually won't take the job.
Correct.
And I know you've been an employer. I've been an employer. I think most middle-class people in this country at some level have been an employer, because in this country we obviously have a massive industry, I suppose, not a formal industry, but of domestic workers and of gardening people and things like that. And so if you own a home, you probably at some point have hired a domestic worker. You may have hired a gardener. And you would know, if you've done that maybe someone somewhere is offering a gardener 50 Rand for the day, which is ridiculously low in terms of a salary. But the chances are that none of the employees I've dealt with at that level would take that money. They would say, no, thank you. I don't want your job. Why would they do that? Well, because they would look at it and go, my taxi fare to get to and from this job is going to be 60 Rand. And so it doesn't make sense for me to work for 50. Or even if I can get there without, I have a bicycle, I run, whatever, I don't know, I live close. It doesn't make sense for me to input that kind of labor for that kind of return, because 50 Rand really doesn't go anywhere. So, and again, perhaps in some rural town out in the Karoo, maybe someone would take $50 to turn some soil in someone's garden, because in that town, maybe that goes a little bit further. Maybe 50 is better than 0.
You're absolutely right. And it cuts to the fundamental heart of the way in which we as individuals should be able to deal with each other. It's the entire concept of winning by a willing buyer, a willing seller. So I'll use an example. Okay, if let's say the kid from down the road comes to my place and says, can I wash your car for $50? And I'll say, okay, wash my car for $50. If he says, can I wash your car for $100? I'll say, no, I'm actually going to wait until I fill up at the Caltex station that's down the road, who then give me a free car wash for a voucher, and which is worth $80, and that's done. The point is that the idea of a willing buyer, willing seller, the person comes forward and says, I'm willing to work for you for this particular fee. That for me is the opening point. Okay, I have the choice of either taking it or leaving it. But you're removing agency from that person to be able to say, for this particular day, guess what? It just so happens that I need an additional $50 for this weekend. I'm going to ask my neighbor, can I, do your garden for $50 for the day? And you might well end up doing that. But I use the very specific example of, let's say, you have a young woman in a township who has a child. She's a single mother. She's gotten her first job. And she now needs someone to look after her child so that she can take the job. But the job is paying, let's say it's paying 4,000 Rand a month as an example. Okay, which then she's taking into account the taxi fare and all of those other things.
Yeah.
Right now, in terms of the law, if she's going to hire someone to look after her child, she has to be paying that person minimum wage, which makes absolutely no sense.
Because it takes up most of the salary.
It takes up most of the salary. At the same time, she's got an unemployed neighbor down the road who's very happy to come into her house.
Yeah, because she lives across the road.
She lives across the road.
She's either not doing anything or she's looking after the woman's kid for a bit of money.
Yes.
Those are her choices.
Yeah. And she's, is she willing to look after the woman's kid for 800
Okay, but
bucks a month?
Kanthan, surely we need to protect, people are stupid. That's what we get told. People are dumb, everyone but us. I'm not dumb. And when people have these conversations around the dinner table at the bar, they're not dumb. And of course, the people elevated to political positions, of course, are not dumb. And the experts, they're not dumb. But the average man on the street, Kanthan, needs to be protected from their own decisions. They're too dumb. They're too dumb to know any of this. They're too dumb to make these decisions. They're going to actually take the job for 50 Rand when taxi fare is 60. They're too dumb. They have to be protected by the government, Kanthan.
I can't help you with any argument in this case, John. What would you like me to say?
Okay, so the point I'm making there, which I think is quite a relevant heuristic that you can use, is if what the government is doing is stepping in as a parent. If it's a type of thing a mother or a father would do for their child, then it should be rejected outright. Responsible adults, there is a reason why we have age of majority. Responsible adults are viewed as having their own decision-making processes, their own agency, and their own ability to decide what they want to do with their life and be accountable for those decisions they make. The government is not put in place to be your mommy or your daddy, to look after you or protect you from your own decisions. And unfortunately, when you go down that road, very bad things happen. And the unemployment that you've been talking about is the reason for this. South African unemployment would be alleviated to a large extent. I wouldn't say fixed, because I think there's a lot of things we could do to fix unemployment, but it would be alleviated to a large extent if the government would get out of the way. I don't know if we wanted to add a little bit more.
So essentially the issue right now is that we have a commodity that we have a surplus of, and that's labor. And at the same time, we have deficiency in terms of jobs. So in this scenario, what we've done is that we've raised the price of labor to the point where it's not able to match the needs of most people who are able to actually make use of that labor. So there are a couple of things that happen. And the most crucial thing is that they use alternatives to actually having that labor. So instead of hiring people to be picking fruit and planting seeds on farms, you invest in machinery that will then do the planting of seeds. And where previously you'd be hiring a couple of thousand people, now suddenly you have one very large machine that does it. But more to the point, that machine will happily work for you for the entire year, never goes on strike, and if it breaks down, there's someone who will come in and actually repair it. Ditto in terms of things like fruit picking.
Sure.
You look in terms of the auto industry, where almost every component used to be hand assembled. That's no longer the case. Now, increasingly, if you take a look at the way in which cars are manufactured, it's automation. The Toyota plants, for example, in Japan, have almost no workers on the floor. And you just simply punch in ahead of time. I want to have a a Toyota Corolla with the following specs. So I wanted to have all-wheel drive. I wanted to have manual transmission. I wanted to have this color paint. And all of that gets punched in, and every single part of the process is entirely automated. So it used to be the case that one of the reasons why we would attract these overseas companies to come and build manufacturing plants here is because labor was cheap. But we're increasingly at the point where labor is no longer cheap. And so they replace it with automation.
The best example of this actually is, I mean, I do have a slight different view on automation, which I'll get to, but the best example of this is really mining in this country. The one side of that argument is, less mining. We don't have enough in the ground anymore, or we've mined all of our gold, for example, which is not true. Or the industry's slowing down globally, which is not true. If you go look at what's gone on in the rest of the world, South America, Australia, Asia, it's just not the case. What happened was we went through Marikana and all the strikes around there. So there were strikes in the years leading up to that and the years following. Around that time, there was this demand for these minimum wages for certain level of workers. So it was like 12,000 Rand, I think at the time, was they wanted for anyone basically who was going underground. And that was significantly increased in terms of the cost. So what subsequently happened was the mines acquiesced, and that was essentially as a result of all of the political pressure at the time. It wasn't driven by an economic argument. It wasn't that they could afford it. It was that they felt they didn't have a choice. And so the payment of these employees went up, and in the years that followed, in fact, 1 year almost to the date after those wage agreements, one of the large, I can't remember which ones, I don't want to name incorrectly, but one of the large mining companies fired or retrenched, I think, around 20,000 workers. And that trend has continued, because when you want to go dig things out of the ground, it costs a lot of money to do that. And then it costs a lot of money thereafter to refine. And it costs a lot of money then to transport those minerals wherever you want to transport them and sell them in the world. And so you have to, like any business, balance the costs and the expenses versus the income. And because we have now created this situation where we have to pay these workers X amount, it just made these businesses less viable. And so maybe they're still viable to the point that they can make money, but generally people with a lot of money who want to invest in businesses don't want to make a 5% return, because you can put your money in a unit trust and make 10.
Now, you see, what's interesting about everything that you've been telling me is that you've so completely bought the mainstream media narrative, because that's not at all what Marikana was about. Marikana was about a jostling for power between two unions. And every single thing that you mentioned just right now is factually incorrect. Okay, so very specifically in terms of the input costs around what people were earning versus what they were asking for was a particular narrative. And I'm going to quote from a piece that I wrote at the time. The single part that seriously pisses me off is the rampant stupidity among my media colleagues who tell us that the striking rock drillers earn 4,000 Rand per month and are wanting a 300% increase to 12,000 Rand per month. Yeah. This is all based from a single soundbite from a single striking worker earlier in the week. CNN has told the world the rock drill operators and assistant rock drill operators who earn 300 to 500 a month want their salaries raised to 1,500 a month. Dollars, they're talking.
Yeah,
of course. Another news manager on Facebook said, "How can Lonmin, third largest platinum mining company in the world, pay those grown men, experienced miners, fathers, and family breadwinners less than 400 a month all these years?" And goes on. So. Now,
so what was I factually wrong about?
So the factual thing, now having sat on both sides of wage negotiations over the years, because I've been in the unions and I've been negotiating on behalf of management, so I picked up the phone to Lonmin and called the communications division and said, send me a breakdown. How much does a rock drill operator actually earn?
Yeah.
Okay. And the answer came forth, and I quote, okay, and this is from Mark Monroe, was Executive Vice President for Mining States. Lonman's rock drill operators earn in the region of $10,000 per month without bonuses and over $11,000 including bonuses. These levels are in line with our competitors and are before the wage hike of 9%, which will come into effect on 1st October 2012. So in other words, the entire thing was a media fabrication.
Okay.
The entire thing.
Right. We're getting into a different topic, but it's fine. I want to get there.
No, but again, what it comes down to is that
I never said Americana wasn't between the two unions.
My starting point,
Yes.
okay, was the chaos that get caused by the Labor Relations Act, which in this particular case has turned these unions into effective superpowers, because once you get to more than 50% of people signing up,
Yes.
every other person in the company is forced to then pay subscriptions to that union as well. Mm-hmm. And what you had in this particular case is an upstart new union that wants to actually have that piece of the puzzle. And so they create dissent among the striking workers, and which leads to actual physical violence.
Yeah.
And ultimately what it's about is for the union bosses to be able to get access to the subscriptions,
Okay.
which comes back to my starting point.
But I'm not wrong about
the Labor Relations Act.
I agree with you on the Labor Relations Act. On this particular example, we can get into Americana sometime, and maybe we should, because I personally think the entire narrative that's been sold publicly is wrong. Our society has been fed pieces of the Americana story. In fact, entire parts of it have been deleted. There was video footage the mainstream media put online, which has been scrubbed completely from the internet. But some of us actually remember it very well. So that whole story is a narrative. It's not that it didn't happen. Obviously it did. But what happened, how it happened, why it happened, all those things have been manipulated. So I don't want to get into that right now. And I know about the union stuff, obviously. What I will say is that the specifics about the salary aside, which fine, the 4,000 and 12,000 was not the issue. A year later, there were massive job cuts in the mining sector, and those have continued over time. That's not fake. That's true. You can go look at the amount of mining we're doing. You can go look at the number of people employed in that sector.
Well, to your point.
Okay, and the reason for that.
No, well, to your point. Let me finish your point for you. Okay. What I said after quoting that bit about the salaries, I said, I have no defense for said rampant stupidity on the part of my media colleagues. I will, however, point out crucial information they've not told us, which is go to Bloomberg.com, look for LON:SJ, and look at those financial statements. Lonman is not raking in profits. It recorded a loss of US $24 million for the financial year ended 31st March on a turnover of $750 million, down from $1 billion the year before. Now, if I'm a shareholder and see my profits going south and those expenses rising, I'm going to get out. If 3,000 rock drillers earn $11,000 per month, that's about $49 million in costs right there, if they want more money. If the rand appreciates against the dollar and the price of platinum declines further, Marikana will be shut down.
Correct.
And tell me about the ugly face of capitalism when those miners no longer have jobs.
Right,
which is exactly what happened.
Well, we don't. We can disagree on the details around that time, and that's excellent written piece. Kanthanpillay.com, I think.
Yeah.
You can find all of Kanthan's writing. But the point I was making is when you interfere in the market, which is what you've been getting at.
Yes.
Then you create this problem, and so those wage demands. Even the 11,000 may be unreasonable for a company that's not making enough money.
Correct.
Right? It maybe they need to pay 10,000.
But consider,
right? And in a company.
But consider more to the point, again, along the questions that we've just been talking about automation. Now, you've probably seen Optimus.
Yeah.
Okay. Optimus is Elon Musk's robot.
Yeah.
Okay. And Optimus, if you track the course of Optimus over the past year, say, there's been drastic improvements in terms of what this robot has been able to do. And remember, this robot is then driven by these massive large language models that have been, again, geometrically outpacing the learning capacities of the previous generations. You will have a situation where those mines will become profitable again. simply because you're no longer sending human beings down inside. You're going to be sending down robots, which will be programmed with precision to do very specific things, and those will become profitable. But the opportunity for the people who could have actually been employed and benefited from it is not going to be there anymore. So between now and where
this is my disagreement on automation, and this is the big argument around AI is going to take all our jobs, and so we need UBI, which is a topic for another discussion.
AI is not going to take the job of a plumber. AI is not going to take the job of an electrician.
Well, and AI has not taken the job. Automation in the Toyota plant in Japan has not taken the job of the guy who needs to come and fix the arm that welds the door onto the car. Okay, nor has it taken the job of the guy who welds the circuit board, or maybe that's automated, but it hasn't taken the job of the guy who answers the telephone or fixes whatever he needs to fix at that factory. The point is that this argument has been used for the entire industrial age, and it's been wrong every single time. Okay, so you will have to show me what's going to find. The argument has been as follows.
You and I are having a very similar discussion to what we had around Starlink, where I proved you wrong.
You haven't proved me wrong because you still haven't shown me a phone that can do Starlink.
When we next get together, this is a phone that can do Starlink.
But it can't.
No, it can.
Show me right now.
No, I cannot show you right now because he hasn't turned it on for us.
He hasn't turned it on for anyone.
He's turned it on for T-Mobile in the US.
When?
As of last week.
Oh, okay. You see?
No, as of last week. What I've been saying to you is that the technology is there. It is coming at a dizzy rate.
And it doesn't matter. Because let me finish my point. When the truck was invented and the car was invented, there was freak out in the horse industry. Absolute mayhem. Okay? If you really want, you actually can go find articles on this about people saying that all the people involved in that industry, all the people fitting shoes to the horses, making saddles for the horses, stabling the horses, etc., this was going to result in this catastrophic job losses and basically the end of large employment in society and whatever. And you know what happened? Truck drivers happened. You know what happened? Mechanics happened. Now, are there problems with doing this too quickly and potentially creating a giant gap?
You and I are in agreement on everything that you are saying so far, but I'd like to draw us back to the core point.
Yes.
The core point is that we as South Africans have a window of opportunity now to actually drive down the cost of wages and get people into employment. Otherwise, we are going to get to the point where it becomes more cost effective to invest in automation. And I'm saying that moving to automation is not inevitable. Automation becomes the case when the price-performance ratio makes it more sensible to go down the route of automation. You get that logic?
Yeah.
Yeah. So right now, if you take the case of robotic strawberry pickers.
Yeah.
Okay. Robotic strawberry pickers are not as efficient as human strawberry pickers currently. Okay. Because they have to move a lot more slowly. Those robotic arms have to very carefully hone in on a strawberry, grip it very carefully, and pluck it. And a human child can do it at a significantly faster rate. The difference, of course, is...
Are you saying we should use the children?
We get our kids to do work at home because it's part of the process.
The children yearn for the mines.
The children yearn for the mines, yeah. I mean, the concept of children as being a protected entity really only dates back to the Victorian era because, from the time that children were old enough to walk, throughout history, every civilization, kids start working. I mean, in our rural areas, kids are out herding the cows. Come on, Let's be clear about this. But, to get back to the economics of this, when does it become more cost-effective to have a robotic strawberry picker? It becomes more cost-effective at the point at which you recognize that the robotic strawberry picker doesn't take lunch breaks and, more importantly, works 24/7. And so if the cost of picking, let's say, 100 strawberries using a robotic strawberry picker is going to be lower than the cost of the human strawberry picker, that's the point at which we kick into automation. And right now, if we simply say that we are not having a minimum price tag on employment, there's an incentive for people to actually be hiring people.
Yeah, I would say that's the one side. And the other side, I do want to finish this up because it's a very long labor discussion. But the other side is obviously...
It's an economic discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so we're talking about the economics of labor. It's not about taking shots at labor. It's about saying labor right now is actually a millstone around the economic neck of South Africa.
Yeah. So I think look, minimum wage is one argument, but the good thing about minimum wage in some respects in this country is that so it doesn't solve any of the problem at the lower end, which is where we do have a major problem.
Why don't we just make it a minimum wage of 50,000 rand a month?
No, I don't want to go there right now. But what I do want to say is that big business doesn't worry about minimum wage. Okay.
And that's the problem, because
Hold
it
on.
penalizes small businesses.
I understand. I understand it penalizes small businesses, penalizes people without skills, it penalizes those types of things. What I'm getting at is that the biggest problem for that at that level is actually the ability to hire and fire. And so if you said to me, you can only have one of two. You can either have no minimum wage or you can have the ability to hire and fire at will.
Which is the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, which is the second thing.
Yeah.
Which
Okay.
is the third thing that I said needed to be repealed.
So,
And yes, the ability
but if I
to
could
hire
only
and
pick
fire.
one,
It's hire and fire.
I would pick hire and fire.
Yeah. Because
Unfortunately, I get the damage that the minimum wage does, but hire and fire at least enables me to say, look, I'm going to meet minimum wage.
And I'm saying you need both of them.
I agree, but I would pick the hire and fire. That's what I would choose.
So let's say, for example, I've got a position that is worth, let's say, 10,000 rand a month. Okay. Would I like the ability to hire, let's say, 3 people at 5,000 rand a month for a period to see which of them is actually going to best fit that particular role, especially since I know I can fill that position at 5,000 rand a month? So I take on 3 people and I choose the best of the lot and say to the other 2, okay, guys, you are out of here. Right now, I don't have the ability to do that. But more importantly, when you suddenly have life-changing scenarios, the company is not in a position to just lay off massive quantities of workers. Very specific example, COVID. Very specific use case, Comair. Okay, a successful South African business running longer than SAA. Okay, consistently profitable for its entire time. Why did it shut down? Because when we had the complete shutdown of the airlines as a result of COVID, Comair, because of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, without earning any revenue, was forced to continue paying those workers. The US did not have that issue. Okay, the US simply laid off all of their workers, and then when the economy came back, they simply rehired all of those workers and went back to it. And it was left to the state to fill the gap in terms of the salaries of those workers. Yeah. Okay, but now Comair is lost and it's never coming back. South Africa has that problem very specifically because when you have those situations, I mean, a factory burns down. Okay, but those employees are on your payroll. You still need to keep paying them. That makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. Got you. All right. Kanthan, thank you. I think we must call it there.
How long have we been going for, by the way?
An hour and 40 minutes.
An hour and 40 minutes.
It's a long time for people to listen to us talking nonsense.
Yeah, somewhat longer than usual. Yeah, but basically those 4 things we need to get rid of, let's be very clear. Basic Conditions of Employment Act, Labor Relations Act, broad-based black economic empowerment, and minimum wage. And you'll watch this economy absolutely fly.
You would. But I will just sadly point out that the chance of any of those going anywhere in the near future, let's call it before the next elections, 2029.
It's not going to happen.
It won't happen.
Yes.
And in fact, All I see is a doubling down on bad policy. NHI, as we've discussed, is the next one that's going to come. I think NHI is a country-ending policy, in my opinion, and so that's quite unfortunate. I would say instead of being doom and gloom, because we don't think they're going to free up the labour market, and they're going to try and press ahead with socialist healthcare. The answer is stop listening to the mainstream media. Make sure that the people around you are aware of the levels of deception that they are being exposed to, the things they're being lied to about, which is pick a topic, everything. Even me, as Kanthan pointed out during this podcast, and importantly, support those people who are pushing back against these things. So if you know of entities that are fighting for the labor market to open up, support them. If you're able to do so financially, do so. If you're just able to do so in your support, then do that. Spread the message. Same goes for the healthcare stuff. Same goes for a lot of the bad policy we have in this country, which is really hamstringing us and preventing us from moving forward. That's it from me.
Let's wrap it there.
As always, we actually would like you to now comment because it seems as if we got rid of the trolls. So we will now read, or I will, Kanthan I think has always been, but I will read the comments. So if you have commentary, there sometimes are some corrections that come in that, which are quite good. So we appreciate that. Thanks to those people who do that. Alternate views and opinions, questions for follow-up podcasts, welcome to put them in the comments. That's on YouTube. If you're listening to this podcast, please like it. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe.
On Spotify as well.
I think Spotify comments are turned on as well, so we can access those too. And let other people know about the podcast if you enjoyed it and what you'd perhaps like us to discuss in the future. Thanks so much for listening, and we will catch you next time. Cheers.